What if the world you think you understand is already gone, and no one officially told you? What if the biggest shifts in money, power, war, and global leadership aren't happening in headlines, but quietly, behind the scenes, while markets move, alliances strain, and trust erodes? Hello, this is John. Today we're going to talk about things most people feel but can't fully explain. Why gold is quietly returning to the center of the financial system. Why trade wars and tariffs are more emotional than strategic. Why military power no longer guarantees victory, and why a war with China would change the world in ways no one is prepared for. We'll break down how the old financial order is losing credibility, why central banks are acting differently, and why sanctions and economic pressure are accelerating the very shifts they were meant to stop. We'll look at China not through propaganda or fear, but through strategic reality, asking whether China is truly an enemy or simply a rival playing a much longer game. We'll explore Taiwan, deterrence, alliances, and the growing gap between political narratives and economic facts. We'll talk about business power versus military power, the weaponization of finance, the limits of dollar dominance, and the rise of a multipolar world that doesn't follow old rules. Most importantly, we'll ask the uncomfortable questions. Are global leaders responding strategically or emotionally? Are we preparing for the future or clinging to the past? And who actually benefits from misunderstanding the world we're moving into? This isn't about choosing sides. It's about understanding the system before it fully changes. So stay with me, because by the end of this discussion, you won't just see global events differently. You'll understand why they're unfolding the way they are. Silver, gold, and the awakening of the market. For a very long time, silver and gold existed in the background of the global financial system. They were always there, always valuable, always essential, but largely ignored. Investors talked about tech stocks, bonds, and currencies, while precious metals were treated like old relics from another era. What's happening now is not that silver and gold suddenly became important. What's happening is that the world finally woke up to what they have always represented. Silver, in particular, has been misunderstood for decades. It is not just a metal for jewelry or collectors. Silver is a strategic industrial metal. It is used in electronics, solar panels, medical equipment, batteries, and advanced technologies that modern economies depend on. For years, demand quietly increased while investment interest stayed low. That imbalance couldn't last forever. When awareness finally caught up with reality, price movements followed rapidly. Recent sharp jumps in silver prices reflect this awakening. These moves are not random speculation. They signal a recognition that silver plays a dual role, both as an industrial necessity and as a monetary asset. When confidence in paper money weakens, silver benefits alongside gold. But unlike gold, silver's supply is far more constrained relative to its industrial demand, making its price moves often faster and more dramatic. Gold tells a similar but deeper story. Gold has always been money, regardless of what modern financial systems try to label it. Long before digital currencies, before central banks, before paper money, gold functioned as a universal store of value. What's changing now is that institutions, not just individuals, are returning to this truth. Over the past few years, central banks around the world have been accumulating gold at record levels. This is not emotional behavior. Central banks act strategically. When they increase gold reserves, it signals concern about currency stability, debt levels, and long-term purchasing power. Gold does not default. It does not depend on political promises. It exists outside the financial system, which is precisely why it becomes more valuable when that system is under stress. The rise in gold prices reflects declining confidence in fiat currencies. Modern money is backed by trust, debt, and policy credibility. When inflation rises, debt expands, and monetary policy becomes unpredictable, that trust weakens. Gold steps in as the ultimate financial insurance, not because it is trendy, but because it is reliable. This awakening in precious metals is not driven by hype. It is driven by fundamentals. Rising government debt, currency dilution, geopolitical uncertainty, and fragile financial structures are pushing both individuals and institutions toward tangible assets. Silver and gold are not reacting to the future. They are responding to what is already unfolding. What we are witnessing now is a shift in mindset. Precious metals are no longer being treated as alternative investments. They are being recognized again as core assets. The world didn't change silver and gold. The world changed its perception of them. And once that perception shifts, markets adjust quickly. This is not the beginning of a trend. It is the recognition of a reality that was ignored for far too long. Tariffs, Trump, China and Canada-US relations. When we talk about tariffs and rising trade tensions, especially between the United States, Canada, and China, it's important to step back and separate emotion from strategy. Much of the current friction is being framed as a geopolitical showdown, but in reality what we're witnessing is closer to a family dispute than a structural breakup of alliances. The United States and Canada have one of the deepest economic relationships in the world. Their supply chains are integrated, their industries overlap, and their economies depend on each other in ways that go far beyond trade statistics. That's why describing recent tensions as a long-term rupture misses the point. This is not hostility, it's disagreement, intensified by personality-driven politics. Tariffs, in theory, are meant to protect domestic industries or pressure competitors into fairer trade practices. In practice, however, they often become blunt instruments. When tariffs are applied reactively, especially against close allies, they tend to create unintended consequences. Costs rise, supply chains fracture, and businesses on both sides of the border pay the price. That is exactly what has been unfolding. The situation becomes even more complicated when China enters the picture. Canada, like many countries, maintains trade relationships with China because China is a major global manufacturing and consumption hub. Responding to that reality with punitive threats or blanket tariffs does not change economic fundamentals. It simply raises the cost of doing business and pushes partners to seek alternatives. One of the key issues here is personalization. Trade disputes are increasingly being framed not as policy disagreements, but as personal challenges to authority or loyalty. When economic decisions are interpreted as political insults, rational strategy takes a back seat. That's dangerous, especially in a global system where cooperation matters more than dominance. From a strategic perspective, punishing allies for engaging in trade with China is counterproductive. It does not weaken China in any meaningful way. Instead, it strains alliances and encourages countries to reduce their dependence on the U.S. system altogether. History shows that economic influence is best maintained through cooperation, not coercion. Another overlooked point is that tariffs rarely stay targeted. Once imposed, they ripple through the economy, impacting consumers, manufacturers, and exporters alike. Inflationary pressure increases, competitiveness declines, and the very industries tariffs are supposed to protect often suffer downstream effects. The Canada-US relationship, however, is resilient. Economic realities will eventually override political theatrics. Both sides understand that cooperation delivers far more value than confrontation. Integrated energy markets, shared infrastructure, and joint resource development are far more powerful tools than tariff threats. Ultimately, trade policy works best when it is boring, predictable, and strategic. Emotional responses and public ultimatums may generate headlines, but they undermine long-term stability. If the goal is economic strength, supply chain security, and global competitiveness, then rebuilding trust with allies must take priority over symbolic punishment. This detail isn't about choosing sides, it's about recognizing that trade wars with friends weaken everyone involved, and history consistently shows that strong alliances, not loud threats, are what sustain economic leadership. Collapse of the old financial system. To understand what's happening in global finance today, we need to recognize that the system many people grew up trusting is no longer as stable as it once appeared. For decades, the Western financial order revolved around a few core pillars: the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, the SWIFT payment system, and financial power concentrated in New York and London. That structure dominated global trade, banking, and capital flows for nearly a century. What we're seeing now is not a sudden collapse, but a slow, visible erosion of confidence. At the heart of this issue is fiat money. Fiat currencies are not backed by physical assets like gold or silver. They are backed by trust. Trust in governments, central banks, and institutions to manage money responsibly. For a long time, that trust held. Economic growth, political stability, and military power reinforced the credibility of Western currencies, especially the US dollar. But trust is not permanent. Over time, excessive debt, persistent deficits, aggressive money printing, and repeated financial crises weaken credibility. When currencies are created in unlimited quantities, their value inevitably comes into question. This is where behavior matters more than rhetoric, and central banks are telling us a very clear story through their actions. Across the world, central banks have been buying gold at record levels. This is not speculation, and it is not ideological. Central banks are among the most conservative financial institutions in existence. They do not chase trends. When they accumulate gold, it signals concern about currency stability and long-term purchasing power. Gold serves a unique role in the financial system. It has no counterparty risk. It cannot be printed. It does not rely on promises or policy decisions. It exists outside political systems, which is precisely why it becomes attractive when those systems show signs of stress. When central banks shift reserves toward gold, they are quietly reducing reliance on fiat currencies dominated by Western control. The SWIFT system and the dollar-based settlement structure were once viewed as neutral infrastructure. In recent years, they have increasingly been used as tools of policy and enforcement. Sanctions, asset freezes, and financial exclusion have demonstrated that access to the Western financial system is conditional. That realization has changed how many countries think about reserves. When reserves can be frozen or confiscated, they are no longer risk-free. That reality has accelerated diversification away from the dollar and toward tangible assets like gold. This doesn't mean the dollar disappears overnight, but it does mean its unquestioned dominance is fading. The old financial system relied on the assumption that Western institutions were permanent, impartial, and unchallengeable. That assumption no longer holds. The world is becoming more fragmented, more multipolar, and more cautious. Countries are hedging against financial vulnerability by holding assets that cannot be controlled by foreign governments. This shift is not ideological rebellion, it is rational risk management. Gold is not replacing currencies in daily transactions, but it is reclaiming its role as the ultimate reserve asset. The message is subtle but unmistakable. Confidence in fiat systems is declining, and the financial order built on them is being rebalanced. The collapse, therefore, is not dramatic, it is structural. And those who understand this shift early are better positioned for what comes next. Rise of BRICS and the weaponization of finance. The rise of BRICS is not an accident, and it is not driven by ideology. It is a direct response to how the global financial system has been used over the last decade. For years, the Western-led financial order was marketed as neutral, rules-based, and open to anyone who followed its framework. That perception has changed, dramatically. At the center of this shift is the weaponization of finance. The US dollar, global banking networks, and settlement systems were once tools of commerce. Today, they are increasingly tools of enforcement. Sanctions, asset freezes, and financial exclusion have become routine policy instruments. While these measures may achieve short-term political goals, they come with long-term strategic consequences. When countries place their reserves in Western banks or rely on dollar-based systems, they are effectively accepting conditional access. That access can be revoked. This reality became undeniable when hundreds of billions of dollars in foreign reserves were frozen or threatened with confiscation. For many nations, that moment changed everything. The message was clear. Reserves held within the Western financial system are not truly sovereign. They are permissions, not property. Once that realization set in, it became rational, not rebellious, for countries to seek alternatives. This is where BRICS enters the picture. What began as a loose economic grouping is evolving into a parallel framework for trade, settlement, and reserve management. The appeal of BRICS is not about replacing one empire with another. It is about reducing exposure to a system that has proven unpredictable and politicized. Membership interest continues to grow because the incentives are clear. Countries want to trade without fear of sanctions. They want reserves that cannot be frozen. They want financial relationships that are transactional, not ideological. BRICS offers a pathway, imperfect, evolving, but increasingly attractive. Gold plays a central role in this shift. Unlike currencies, gold cannot be sanctioned. It cannot be digitally blocked or seized through a keystroke. For BRICS nations, gold provides neutrality. It allows settlement outside dollar channels and serves as a bridge asset between systems that do not fully trust one another. This does not mean BRICS is a unified economic bloc with a single vision. It isn't. What unites these countries is not political alignment. It is shared vulnerability. Each has experienced or observed the consequences of financial dependence on Western systems. Their response is diversification, not confrontation. The expansion of BRICS membership reflects this logic. As more countries witness how financial pressure is applied, the motivation to opt out grows stronger. This creates a feedback loop. The more finance is weaponized, the faster alternatives develop. Importantly, this shift does not signal the immediate collapse of the dollar or Western finance. What it signals is competition. For the first time in decades, countries are openly planning for a world where access to Western systems is optional, not mandatory. The weaponization of finance has reshaped global behavior. BRICS is not the cause, it is the consequence. And once nations begin building parallel systems, they rarely return to dependence. The world is not abandoning the old system overnight, but it is quietly preparing for life beyond it. Geopolitics, Greenland, and rare earths. When discussions turn to geopolitics, especially around strategic regions like Greenland or the Arctic, the conversation often drifts toward military power and territorial control. But this misses the real issue. The true battle today is not over land. It is over resources, supply chains, and industrial capacity. Rare earth elements sit at the center of that battle. Rare earths are not rare in the sense of scarcity, but they are rare in economically viable, well-developed supply chains. These materials are essential for modern life. They are used in advanced electronics, defense systems, renewable energy technologies, electric vehicles, precision weapons, and communications infrastructure. Whoever controls their extraction, refinement, and processing holds significant strategic leverage. China understood this decades ago. Instead of threatening military action or issuing public ultimatums, China quietly invested in mining, refining, and energy infrastructure. Today, China dominates rare earth processing, not because it has all the resources, but because it built the industrial backbone required to turn raw material into usable output. This is where Western strategy has failed. Rather than focusing on building competitive refining and processing capacity, Western leaders have relied on rhetoric, sanctions, and political pressure. That approach does nothing to solve the underlying problem: dependence. You cannot sanction your way out of a supply chain weakness. Greenland, the Arctic, and offshore discoveries in places like Norway and Canada highlight this contradiction. The resources exist within friendly or neutral jurisdictions. The problem is not access, it is execution. Environmental delays, regulatory paralysis, high energy costs, and lack of long-term planning have stalled development. The solution is not confrontation, it is cooperation. Instead of threatening to seize territory or framing resource access as a geopolitical standoff, the smarter approach is partnership. Joint ventures, shared infrastructure, and coordinated industrial strategy would deliver far more value than military posturing. Energy costs are a critical piece of this equation. Rare earth refining is energy-intensive. China maintains its advantage partly because it subsidizes energy costs to make refining economically viable. Competing requires acknowledging this reality. Without affordable energy, refining capacity cannot scale. Ideological resistance to energy subsidies only guarantees continued dependence. North America, particularly the United States and Canada together, is uniquely positioned to address this challenge. Canada has vast mineral resources. The United States has capital, technology, and industrial experience. What's missing is integration, shared refining hubs, coordinated logistics, and aligned policy incentives. Building refineries near shared borders with access to rail, ports, and power would reduce reliance on foreign processing while strengthening allied supply chains. This is not about isolationism. It is about resilience. A secure supply chain does not require domination. It requires competence. The obsession with geopolitical drama distracts from practical solutions. No amount of rhetoric about Greenland, Arctic control, or strategic competition changes the fact that resources only matter if they can be processed efficiently and affordably. Power today comes from production, not possession. The rare earth issue exposes a broader truth. Economic strength in the modern world is built through infrastructure, planning, and cooperation, not threats. Nations that understand this will lead the next industrial cycle. Those that don't will continue reacting instead of competing. Business power versus military power. For much of modern history, power has been defined by military strength, the size of armies, the reach of navies, and the ability to project force-shaped global influence. But the world has changed. In today's environment, real power is increasingly determined not by how many weapons a country has, but by how effectively it can produce, trade, and compete economically. Business power, not military power, is now the primary driver of lasting influence. Military force still matters, but it is a blunt tool. It is expensive, slow, and often ineffective when used as a first option. Wars destroy value. They consume capital, manpower, and political legitimacy. Even when military action succeeds tactically, it rarely delivers long-term economic or strategic benefits. This is why relying on threats and force as a default policy is increasingly counterproductive. Economic power works differently. It builds influence through interdependence rather than fear. When nations trade, invest, and build infrastructure together, they create shared interests. These relationships are harder to break and far more resilient than alliances maintained by coercion. Strong economies attract partners. Weak economies intimidate, but only temporarily. The most successful global strategies in recent decades have not involved invasions or military threats. They have involved supply chains, financing, energy infrastructure, and industrial planning. Countries that dominate manufacturing, logistics, and resource processing set the terms of global trade without firing a shot. This distinction becomes especially clear when comparing rhetoric to results. Threatening military action may generate headlines, but it does not build factories, refineries, or ports. It does not lower energy costs. It does not create jobs or stabilize currencies. Business-oriented policies do. Economic competition also allows for flexibility. Deals can be renegotiated. Partnerships can evolve. Markets adjust. Military conflicts, once initiated, spiral beyond control and impose costs long after the fighting ends. History repeatedly shows that wars solve fewer problems than they create. Another critical issue is credibility. A country that constantly threatens force signals insecurity, not strength. Truly powerful nations do not need to remind others of their military capacity. They demonstrate strength through stability, productivity, and reliability. Businesses prefer predictable partners, not volatile ones. When leaders prioritize business over confrontation, They shift national focus toward growth instead of destruction. That means investing in infrastructure, energy, education, and industrial capacity. It means negotiating access to resources instead of seizing them. It means competing on efficiency rather than intimidation. This does not imply abandoning defense or national security. Military strength should exist as a deterrent and a last resort, not as the foundation of foreign policy. When military power becomes the primary tool of engagement, it signals strategic failure elsewhere. In the modern world, influence is earned through value creation. Countries that can provide affordable energy, reliable manufacturing, and stable trade relationships will shape global outcomes. Those that rely on force will find themselves isolated, overstretched, and economically weaker over time. The lesson is simple but often ignored. You cannot threaten your way into prosperity. Sustainable power comes from commerce, not conflict. Nations that understand this will lead the future. Those that don't will keep fighting battles that no longer matter. China. Enemy or strategic rival? One of the most repeated narratives in global politics today is the idea that China is an enemy. That framing is emotionally powerful, but it is strategically misleading. The more accurate question is not whether China is an enemy, but whether China is a strategic rival, and understanding the difference matters enormously. An enemy is someone you seek to defeat or destroy. A strategic rival is someone you must compete with, manage, and sometimes cooperate with. Treating China as an enemy leads to confrontation and escalation. Treating China as a rival forces discipline, strategy, and realism. The latter approach produces results. The former creates risk. China's rise did not happen in isolation. It occurred within a global system that welcomed Chinese participation. Western economies opened their markets, transferred technology, and allowed access to capital. This was not imposed, it was permitted. To frame China's success solely as aggression ignores the role of Western policy decisions. From a strategic standpoint, China behaves as a civilizational power, not a reactionary state. Its planning horizon spans decades, not election cycles. It prioritizes long-term stability, internal cohesion, and economic capacity. This does not make China benevolent, but it does make it predictable. And predictability is critical in managing rivalry. Where problems emerge is in access and exposure. When countries allow unrestricted entry into sensitive industries, research facilities, real estate, and academic institutions, they create vulnerabilities. Every major power protects its core interests. China does this openly. The West has often failed to do the same, confusing openness with strength. Managing rivalry does not require hostility. It requires boundaries. That means deciding where cooperation is acceptable and where access must be limited. Trade in non-sensitive goods can continue. Academic exchange can exist with oversight. Critical technologies, infrastructure, and strategic industries require protection. War rhetoric, on the other hand, reflects strategic failure. A military conflict with China would be catastrophic economically and humanly, and it would not solve the underlying competition. China's scale, geography, and industrial depth make direct confrontation unwinnable in any meaningful sense. Even a limited conflict would disrupt global supply chains, financial systems, and living standards worldwide. A smarter approach focuses on competition, not destruction. That means strengthening domestic industries, securing supply chains, investing in energy and manufacturing, and reducing dependencies. Competing effectively requires improving one's own system, not sabotaging another's. There is also a misconception that rivalry must be ideological. It doesn't. Countries with vastly different systems have coexisted, traded, and competed throughout history. The goal is not to convert China or isolate it entirely, but to engage from a position of strength and clarity. Ultimately, labeling China as an enemy simplifies a complex reality but creates dangerous outcomes. Strategic rivalry acknowledges competition without demanding catastrophe. It prioritizes resilience over retaliation and preparation over provocation. The future will not be shaped by who shouts the loudest or threatens the most. It will be shaped by who plans better, produces more efficiently, and adapts faster. China is not an enemy to be destroyed. It is a rival to be understood and competed with intelligently. War with China. Why it's unwinnable. The idea of a war with China is often discussed casually in political debates, media commentary, and think tank panels. But when examined through a serious strategic lens, the conclusion is unavoidable. A direct war with China is not winnable in any meaningful sense. Not militarily, not economically, and not politically. First, geography alone makes victory impossible. China would be fighting on its own doorstep, while any opposing force would be operating thousands of miles from home. History consistently shows that defending territory is far easier than projecting power across oceans. China has built its military doctrine around this reality, focusing on denying access rather than conquering distant lands. China's coastal defenses, missile systems, air power, and surveillance capabilities are designed to make intervention extremely costly. Modern warfare is no longer about fleets sailing freely or aircraft carriers dominating uncontested seas. Large platforms are now highly vulnerable. Missiles are cheaper, faster, and harder to intercept than the assets they target. In a conflict near China's territory, losses would be immediate and severe. Scale is another critical factor. China possesses enormous industrial capacity and population depth. In a prolonged conflict, it can replace equipment, personnel, and infrastructure far faster than any external power operating far from home. Wars are not won in the first week. They are won by sustaining production, logistics, and morale over time. China holds a decisive advantage in that domain. There is also a dangerous misunderstanding of military comparison. Demonstrating power in permissive environments is not the same as fighting a peer competitor. Success against weaker adversaries does not translate into dominance against a technologically capable, well-prepared nation. A war with China would involve contested airspace, contested seas, and continuous cyber and economic disruption. Economics makes the picture even darker. China is deeply embedded in global supply chains. A war would instantly disrupt manufacturing, trade, energy markets, and financial systems worldwide. The economic damage would not be confined to one region. It would be global and immediate. Inflation, shortages, and financial instability would follow within weeks. Even if one imagines a scenario where military objectives are partially achieved, the cost would far outweigh any strategic gain. The destruction of trade, capital flows, and economic confidence would undermine domestic stability long before victory could be claimed. A war that devastates your own economy is not a victory, it is self-inflicted damage. There is also the issue of escalation. A major conflict between nuclear-armed powers cannot be neatly contained. Miscalculations, accidents, and pressure to escalate would always loom in the background. The margin for error is razor-thin. The real danger lies in treating war as a policy option rather than a failure of policy. War with China would not resolve competition. It would not restore dominance. It would not secure long-term stability. It would permanently alter the global order in unpredictable and dangerous ways. The rational conclusion is not weakness. It is realism. Strategic competition does not require military confrontation. Strength today is measured by resilience, economic capacity, and strategic patience. A war with China would not be won. It would be endured, and everyone would lose. Taiwan. Symbol, not strategy. Taiwan is often presented as the flashpoint that will define the future of global order. In reality, Taiwan has become more of a symbol than a true strategic objective. The way it is discussed publicly is far removed from how serious policymakers and military planners privately assess the situation. From an analytical perspective, Taiwan represents credibility, not conquest. For China, it is a historical and political issue tied to legitimacy. For the United States, it has become a test of deterrence optics. But symbols are dangerous when they override practical calculation. Escalating over symbolism risks consequences that far outweigh any tangible gain. Deterrence is not what it used to be. Traditional deterrence was built on clear red lines, predictable responses, and mutual understanding of costs. That framework is eroding. Today's deterrence is clouded by media narratives, domestic politics, and rapid information warfare. In my assessment, the greatest risk is not intentional conflict, but miscalculation. Leaders operate under pressure to appear strong rather than act prudently. When deterrence becomes performance-driven instead of strategy-driven, stability weakens. Sanctions as a strategic failure. Sanctions were once a precision tool. They are now a blunt instrument. Overuse has diluted their effectiveness and encouraged adaptation rather than compliance. From an analytical standpoint, sanctions accelerate de-dollarization, strengthen alternative trade systems, and push targeted nations towards self-reliance. Instead of isolating rivals, sanctions often create parallel ecosystems that permanently reduce Western leverage. The long-term cost of sanctions is trust, and once lost, trust is rarely recovered. The weaponization of finance was once neutral infrastructure. It is no longer perceived that way. Freezing reserves, restricting payment systems, and politicizing capital flows have fundamentally changed how nations view the global financial system. As an analyst, I see this as a turning point. When money becomes conditional, it ceases to be universal. That is why gold, commodities, and regional settlement mechanisms are gaining momentum. This is not ideology, it is insurance. The myth of permanent dollar dominance. The dollar will not collapse tomorrow. That narrative is simplistic and wrong. But permanence is also a myth. Reserve currencies rise and fade based on confidence, discipline, and neutrality. What concerns me is not dollar usage today, but trajectory. Rising debt, politicized finance, and declining fiscal restraint weaken long-term credibility. Reserve status is not a birthright. It is rented, and rent must be paid through stability. China's long game versus short-term systems. China's greatest advantage is not military or economic. It is temporal. Planning horizons measured in decades allow for patience and adjustment. Western systems, driven by election cycles and quarterly results, struggle with long-term execution. From an analytical viewpoint, this mismatch shapes outcomes more than ideology. Strategic patience outperforms reactive policy almost every time. Technology as the new battleground. Technology competition is replacing territorial competition. Semiconductors, AI, energy storage, and data infrastructure now define strategic leverage. Attempts to block technological advancement rarely succeed. They delay, but they also incentivize domestic innovation. In the long run, competition accelerates development on all sides, often to the disadvantage of those relying on restriction rather than investment. The illusion of alliance unity. Alliances look solid on paper, but interests diverge under pressure. Economic realities eventually override political declarations. From my perspective, alliances today are conditional. Energy prices, trade exposure, and domestic stability matter more than slogans. When costs rise, cohesion weakens. This is not betrayal. It is rational behavior. Multipolarity is not chaos. Multipolarity is often framed as disorder. I disagree. Multipolar systems are more complex, but they are also more balanced. Power concentration creates fragility. Distribution creates resilience. The transition is uncomfortable because it reduces dominance. But discomfort should not be confused with instability. A world with multiple centers of power forces negotiation instead of coercion. The real risk: internal fragility. The greatest threat facing major powers is not external rivals. It is internal erosion. Debt, inequality, institutional distrust, and political polarization weaken societies from within. As an analyst, I believe external confrontation often serves as distraction from domestic reform. History shows that declining systems look outward when they should look inward. Where the world is actually heading, the future will not be defined by a single winner. It will be defined by adaptability. Nations that balance sovereignty with cooperation will thrive. Those clinging to outdated dominance models will struggle. China will rise, but it will also face limits. The West will remain powerful, but less central. The system will fragment, regionalize, and recalibrate. The question is not who wins, but who adjusts. Final conclusion: the end of one world, the beginning of another. As we close this discussion, one truth becomes impossible to ignore. The world we inherited is not the world we are moving into. Across these 20 chapters, we've examined money, power, trade, war, China, the West, and the systems that once seemed permanent. What emerges is not a story of collapse overnight, but a story of transition, slow, complex, and deeply consequential. The old financial order, built on fiat trust and centralized control, is being questioned. The old idea that military dominance alone defines power is fading. The belief that one nation or one system can dictate global outcomes is steadily losing relevance. In its place, we see a world becoming multipolar, transactional, and more grounded in real assets, real production, and real interests. China's rise is not an accident, and the West's challenges are not the result of a single rival. These are outcomes of long-term decisions, structural incentives, and shifting priorities. Competition is inevitable, but conflict is not. The greatest risks ahead do not come from external enemies alone, but from miscalculation, overconfidence, and failure to adapt. History teaches us that transitions are rarely comfortable. They challenge assumptions, expose weaknesses, and force hard choices. But they also create opportunities for reform, for balance, and for a more resilient global structure. Strength in this new era will not be measured by how loudly power is projected, but by how sustainably it is maintained. What matters now is realism over rhetoric, strategy over emotion, and long-term thinking over short-term reactions. Nations that understand this will shape the future. Those that resist it will struggle against forces larger than any single policy or leader. This is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a new chapter in global history, and understanding it clearly is the first step toward navigating it wisely. Before we end, I want to sincerely thank you for staying with me through this full discussion. Your time, your attention, and your curiosity matter. If you found value in this analysis, I encourage you to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more deep, honest conversations about economics, geopolitics, and the forces shaping our future. Until next time, stay informed, stay critical, and stay ahead of the narrative.